Hi, everyone, and welcome to our monthly presentation for 5-Star Chemicals Homebrew Club program. We're really excited about our presentation today with John Palmer. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. If you want to just put in the chat where you're from, say hello, any of that, you can do so in the right of your screen. If you do have any questions, please use the Ask a Question prompt at the bottom of your screen. We will get to that after John is finished with his presentation. And so with that, I will turn it over to the John Palmer. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. Fun to be presenting again. Haven't been doing it as much lately. So today I'm going to talk about the total fermentation of beer. I'm sure to many of you, fermentation seems mysterious. You read about and hear about all these various factors that you're supposed to be aware of, and there is a lot of science to it, but a lot of it boils down to just understanding yeast as a living organism that is just as lazy as you are. So let's proceed. I guess I know it. There we go. Okay. So yeast management. The brewer makes the wort, the yeast make the beer. You must have a sufficient amount of clean, healthy yeast. Now, sufficient is a very critical word here. You want to have enough. You don't want to necessarily want to have too much, and you certainly don't want to have too little. Okay, so you want to have a sufficient amount, and you want that yeast to be fresh, that is full of vitality, very healthy, and you want to have a sufficient number of them in the pitch. That's your pitching rate or the viability of the yeast. If you manage the yeast, then you manage the beer. Control of yeast growth is the ultimate answer to most every question about fermentation and fermentation control. Okay, and so these are the concepts we're going to explore today. Going back to vitality and viability. Vitality is the health of the yeast, how fresh they are, whether they're half dead or not, if they've been stressed through a previous fermentation or whatever, or if they're freshly pitched from a starter. Fresh yeast are healthy yeast. Viability is the percentage of them that are healthy. So within a mass of yeast or a count, counting them on a microscope, the viability count is the percentage of them that are alive and therefore able to ferment your beer. To brew good beer, you must have healthy yeast and enough of them to get the job done. As a brewer, you have two options whenever you brew. You can brew the same beer as last time, or you can brew a different beer. Now, and that I mean this in terms of even if you're brewing the exact same recipe, okay? To brew the same beer from the same recipe, you must have the same fermentation. This is a very key concept. To brew the same beer from the same recipe, you must have the same fermentation. And this is what professional brewers struggle with all the time. They are trying to produce a consistent product for their customers. And to do that, they have to have the same fermentation. To have the same fermentation, you must have the same rate of growth and the same total amount of yeast growth. If you change any condition of that fermentation, the temperature, the pitching rate, the nutrient load, agitation, geometry, whatever. If you change any of those conditions that can affect yeast growth, you will have brewed a different beer. Now, it may be a big difference, it may be a small difference, but it will be a difference. Let's look at the life cycle of yeast a bit. From the yeast point of view, there's three phases. There is the adaptive phase, where they undergo physical growth, over here in the upper right. There's the high growth phase, during which they, there we go. The high growth phase, when they reproduce, they typically produce 2 to 4 daughter cells during fermentation. And then there's the stationary phase. After what we would consider fermentation is done, all the food's gone, they go into a hibernation kind of phase, what we call the stationary phase. They flocculate and settle out. From a brewer's point of view, there's 4 phases of fermentation. There's the adaptation or lag phase. There's the attenuation or high growth phase. Then there's the maturation phase, where the beer off flavors and Vdks and so on are cleaned up. And then there's the clarification or stationary phase, where the yeast flocculate, settle out, the haze drops, and fermentation is officially over at that point. It's important to understand that the yeast don't care about your beer. The yeast do not have a maturation phase. It is your job as the brewer to create the conditions for good maturation to occur. Now, what is maturation? Well, maturation is the cleanup of all these byproducts and waste products that they've produced during fermentation. And they produce a number of fatty acids, they produce esters, acetohydroxy acids, which turn into VDKs. They produce alcohols, even high alcohols, what we call fusel alcohols, carbon dioxide, additional aldehydes, lipids, etc., etc. Rapid growth produces lots of waste. So if you have a high fermentation temperature, then the yeast will be very active. They will grow very quickly. They will grow without taking time to clean up their waste. Think of the movie Office Space. Think of working in a cubicle. If you just getting work piled on you, and you're ordering DoorDash or whatever and getting snacks delivered, and you're just kind of throwing them to the side so you can keep working, you produce a lot of waste. You don't take time to put it in the bin, recycle it, et cetera, to extend the metaphor. Okay? Rapid growth produces lots of waste. This is, as it says, a highly simplified diagram of yeast metabolism. Essentially, what happens is that there are wort sugars, there are other nutrients, triglycerols, phospholipids, fatty acids, and lipids. There's wort amino acids. The yeast take all these things in, generate pyruvate to create energy, and in doing so, they create the byproducts we know and love, ethanol and carbon dioxide. They also produce acetaldehyde, which is not liked. They produce acetohydroxy acids or alpha acetolactate, which can turn into diacetyl. They are also producing other amino acids and aldehydes, which can turn into fusel alcohols and esters. Okay, there's a lot going on in yeast metabolism. What's important to understand, though, that this is an interrelated system. The more you do in one direction, the more you'll also produce in other directions. So the faster the yeast grow, generating pyruvate for energy, the more of these byproducts they'll kick out as well. So the yeast need a lot of wort nutrients to grow. They need vitamins, they need minerals, they need amino acids, what we refer to as FAN or free amino nitrogen. They also require a number of different lipids, and these are sterols and unsaturated fatty acids. Okay, all these are very basic building blocks. And when they need them right then. they are first come, first served. They have very small mouths. They can only take in one thing at a time. And so if they can't get what they need, from the wort, or if they're busy consuming something else and they need this other compound at the same time, they'll synthesize it. And synthesis also creates additional byproducts. Okay. And of course, we've talked about the need for wort aeration, for wort oxygen that is used chemically, biochemically in the synthesis of these additional sterols and short chain fatty acids. Okay. Now, these lipids and sterols are essential building blocks for the yeast cell membrane. These nutrients are stored in the vacuole, which, if you go back to the previous diagram, is essentially a storage closet in the yeast cell for critical nutrients. That storage cell is shared with the daughter cell. It splits during the budding, and so that every daughter cell gets a portion of the nutrient reserves of the mother cell. Okay, so it's shared with the daughter cell. And I misspoke earlier. Short chain fatty acids are produced during the synthesis of long chain fatty acids, which are incorporated into the membrane of the cell. They're part of that synthesis of essential lipids and sterols for the cell. But the short chain fatty acids that are nipped off in the synthesis are toxic waste to the yeast cell. And one way that the yeast cell detoxifies them is to esterify them, convert them to esters. So esterification consists of a short chain fatty acid combined with an alcohol to produce particular esters. Okay, and the faster the yeast cell is growing, the more synthesis it has to do, the more of these short chain fatty acids it'll produce, the more esters that it'll produce. Now, esterification is promoted by the action of two enzymes, and these are the acetyl-CoA enzyme and alcohol acetyltransferase. Okay. Again, as it says here, different combinations of fatty acids and alcohols produce different esters, and this varies by yeast strain. Yeast strain A will produce lots of banana ester. Yeast strain B will produce lots of pineapple ester, for example. And they often produce the same kinds of esters, but in different proportions. Okay, very, very individual between yeast strain. So esters are also produced or promoted under stressful growth conditions when there's lots of cellular waste. Optimal growth of yeast in the fermentation would produce low esters. Okay. So, and this model of ester growth and ester promotion is general. Okay. There are exceptions. There are conditions that are exceptions to this, but in general, optimal growth produces fewer esters because the yeast are not under stressful conditions and therefore not generating excessive waste. Now, these stresses can be either famine or feast. Famine means that there's a lack of essential nutrients, or low temperature, low oxygen, which requires more synthesis and therefore more esters. You can also have the opposite condition, a feast condition, where you have an overabundance of specific nutrients that shields the yeast cell from other nutrients that they need, and therefore they synthesize more. You can also have high oxygen conditions, which promotes cell growth, or high temperature, which also promotes cell growth. Both of those conditions would lead to rapid growth and therefore more synthesis, more byproducts being kicked out of the cell rather than being reduced to, in detox within the cell, and therefore you get more esters as well. So it helps to think of and to understand that yeast growth and the factors that affect yeast growth is what we, a natural curve, like a bell curve. You can have both feast conditions and famine conditions. So the two primary byproducts that can be cleaned up by the yeast during maturation are diacetyl, which is that buttery flavor that you can get in a beer, and this comes from alpha acetolactate. It's an acetohydroxy acid. The two vicinal diketones are diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione. Okay, I'll talk more about each of these in a minute. And the other one, of course, is the acetaldehyde, which is that intermediate step in the production of ethanol. If the yeast is experiencing rapid growth and they're taking in lots of food and creating lots of energy, to reproduce, they're going to excrete the acetaldehyde out of the cell rather than leaving it in the cell and excreting it as alcohol. They're just going to get rid of it as fast as they can. And you end up with so rapid growth produces lots of acetaldehyde in the wort, okay, or in the new beer. Zinc is a very important cofactor for acetaldehyde reduction. It's important to understand that fermentation is not done until maturation is done. Okay, fermentation is so often gauged strictly by, the gravity. Did you hit your final gravity? That's only part of the story. You're also looking at what is, the VDKs, what is the acetaldehyde retention, and the yeast need time to do that. Now then, let's talk more about diacetyl formation. Diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione are formed by chemical oxidation, which is decarboxylation of acetohydroxy acids. Okay, and you can see here that you have an acetolactate molecule. You strip away a carbon dioxide and 2 hydrogens, and that turns that molecule into diacetyl. Same with acetohydroxybutyrate. You take away the carbon dioxide and 2 hydrogens, and you get the 2,3-pentanedione molecule. Again, this is a purely chemical reaction. It is not related to the yeast. The yeast do not excrete diacetyl or pentanedione. Let's see, where was I? There we go. Darn scroll wheel, it's really twitchy. Okay. The yeast do not excrete diacetyl or pentanedione. They excrete these acetohydroxy acids. Those are a waste product to the yeast. The yeast cannot do anything with those acetohydroxy acids. Once the acetohydroxy acids have chemically oxidized to diacetyl and pentanedione, then the yeast can take them up. Okay, and these acetohydroxy acids are created by the yeast during the synthesis of critical group B amino acids, valine and isoleucine. Valine and isoleucine are group B amino acids. They are slowly absorbed during the first 12 hours of fermentation and a little bit more quickly after that, after the majority of group A amino acids have been consumed. So it's just like boarding an airline. If you're in group 1, group 2, group 3, you're finally getting up to the gate, about to hand your ticket in, and then here comes somebody in group 1 that goes ahead of you. Well, it's the exact same thing with the yeast. They take in group A amino acids preferentially. And so even though as they're growing, they'll need group B amino acids, and they can't go any further without them, they have all this group A in front of them that prevents them from seeing the group B. So what they'll do is they'll synthesize those group B amino acids, and that's when the acetohydroxy acids are created and excreted from the yeast cell. Okay? That's that mechanism. And again, these amino acids are organized into 4 groups. Group A is first, then B, then C. Generally, only group A and B are actually used by the yeast by the time they get, through the adaptive phase and then fermentation. Your group C and D amino acids are mostly underutilized. So the total amount of excess acetohydroxy acids in the wort depends on the amount of yeast growth that occurred and how it grew, how fast it grew. Okay, so it depends on the yeast growth rate and the pitching rate, what the need in of the yeast is for free amino nitrogen, and the availability of that free amino nitrogen. So a wort with a moderate amount of low protein adjuncts, such as flake corn, flake rice, etc., or worts that have a high percentage of melanoidin malts, where the amino acids have been, roasted and converted to other things, and don't contribute amino acids. That will mean that there is overall less group A in that wort, which will be taken up quickly by the yeast, allowing the group B amino acids to be available to the cell. And that will reduce the overall need for valine and isoleucine synthesis. Okay, that's in a moderate amount of adjunct wort. In a high adjunct wort, where you have just low levels of amino acids overall, and I'm talking about American light lager or worts with even higher percentages of simple sugars or low protein adjuncts. That means that the yeast will run through the available amino acids more quickly, and then again, more synthesis is required, and they're going to kick out lots of the acetohydroxy in doing so. For a low adjunct wort, such as an all malt wort, there's going to be a ton of group A available, which will suppress the group B intake, and that means more synthesis again. Okay, so you have the high adjunct wort that's going to have a lot of acetohydroxy created. You're going to have the low adjunct wort, all malt wort, which is also tends to mean more acetohydroxy generated, and then you have the moderate adjunct wort, where you have not too much, not too little, but just right, and lower need for synthesis, less diacetyl as a result. Okay, it's like Goldilocks and the 3 bears. Too hot, too cold, just right; too big, too small, just right. Okay. Again, re-emphasize that yeast cannot maturate acetohydroxy acids. They have to wait till this chemical reaction occurs that converts it to pentanedione, that converts it to diacetyl, and then they can take it up again and chemically reduce it, create energy from it. And because it is a chemical reaction, it responds to chemical reaction kinetics. Okay, higher temperature means faster conversion. Lower pH also means faster conversion. Lower pH corresponding to a more chemically active solution. Okay. Dry hopping tends to raise beer pH by about 1/10 for every 4 grams per liter or 1 pound per barrel of hops. Okay? So when you're dry hopping, you tend to raise the beer pH, which can slow the chemical reaction, the chemical conversion of diacetyl to pentane, of acetohydroxy to diacetyl. Okay. And a couple examples down here at the bottom of the slide, comparison of temperature, at any one pH lower temperature, 2 degrees C lower, it takes about 42 hours longer. Higher pH can cause that to be 66 hours longer for that conversion to occur. And this is why we talk about raising the temperature for diacetyl rests. By raising the temperature, we get the yeast more active, we speed this chemical conversion, and the diacetyl gets cleaned up. The yeast can reduce diacetyl about 10 times faster than the chemical conversion can make it. Okay? So again, if you have a sufficient amount of yeast and give them the activity and the right temperature conditions, they will clean up the beer. And at the end of fermentation, there's typically maybe 30% of total acetohydroxy acids left over. There is not a separate maturation phase where the yeast, switch over from fermenting sugars to fermenting acetohydroxy acids. No, it all happens concurrently, all right? But they know that sugar is a bigger bang for the buck. So there is going to be acetohydroxy acid left over, when the sugars are gone, and it's typically about 30%. So what you've got to do is you've got to encourage the yeast to stick around, not flocculate, and consume those acetohydroxy acids. Acidification of the beer to counter your dry hopping pH rise can help reduce this residual acetolactate and therefore diacetyl in the package. Okay, I'll talk more about this in a minute. Another aspect, of course, is bottling acetohydroxy acids. You don't want to chill and package your beer too soon. If the beer is cold, the acetohydroxy will not convert to diacetyl and the yeast won't touch it. One way to find out is to do a Vdk test. Take a sample of beer from the fermenter, heat it up to about 65, 70 degrees C, that's about 150 Fahrenheit, 160, and you can do this in the microwave, okay? Just heat it up to that temperature and smell it. That warm temperature is going to convert the acetohydroxy to diacetyl, and you'll be able to smell butter. And if you don't smell it before putting it in the microwave and smell it after taking it out, then you know that there's still residual acetohydroxy in the beer that the yeast haven't cleaned up yet, and that beer needs more time on the yeast before you package it. So keep doing your diacetyl rest. There are products today, such as this enzyme, ALDC, which will reduce diacetyl production directly from the acetohydroxy to alpha acetolactate. It essentially takes the place of the yeast. And this can be a big help for commercial brewers in reducing diacetyl entirely. So, and the usage rate is about 1 to 5 grams per hectoliter, or 10 to 50 ppm. Okay, that's a commercial product. You probably won't see it on the homebrew level. So moving on from diacetyl and acetaldehyde, let's talk about sulfates and sulfides and sulfites. In addition to the synthesis of amino acids and so on, the yeast also need vitamins. And deficiency of vitamins and certain amino acids can cause sulfur production to occur. They will synthesize necessary vitamins, they will synthesize necessary amino acids, and they do that by taking apart other amino acids and sulfur compounds that are available in the wort. And one way they do this is they take sulfate from the water and they'll convert that to sulfite, HCO3, HSO3, and then they'll react that to produce the necessary aminos and thiols. And they'll often have a reduced sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide as a result, and that will be excreted from the cell. And this is one reason that you typically smell rotten eggs from lager fermentations. Some of these lager yeast strains excel, or actually they need more of these sulfur-bearing vitamins and sulfur-bearing amino acids. They need more of them proportionally than other yeast strains. And so they will synthesize more of them and therefore kick out more hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide into the beer than other yeast strains. And you need to give the yeast time and the beer time to vent those sulfur compounds if you don't want the beer to taste sulfury. Okay? So if you are experiencing an excess of sulfite and sulfide in your beer, it's likely due to wort nutrient deficiency. And it's the similar mechanism to the acetolactate production of diacetyl, where there's more synthesis necessary and kicking out more of the byproducts. Okay. So to control our fermentation, to control and manage our yeast, we need to control the growth rate. So we do that by providing a sufficient amount of nutrients. Again, we're trying to hit the peak of that bell curve. We want to avoid having too much or too little of the various nutrients. And this can be lipids, free amino nitrogen or amino acids, zinc is another one, and oxygen. And we want to moderate the temperature. It helps to start cool. Start out this yeast growth slowly. Okay? You can start cool and finish warm. Think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. The second step is to have enough active yeast to clean up the waste. And this is where we get into conversations about pitching rate. We always talk about 1 billion cells per liter per degree Plato. The degree Plato is 4 gravity points. So, match the amount of yeast you're pitching to the strength of the wort that you're fermenting, and you do that, and you match that to make sure there's a sufficient amount of yeast to get the job done. Now, typically the yeast mass will increase about 4 times during fermentation. Then there are lipid reserves that, in the vacuole will be exhausted. They'll be done for reproducing, and they enter the stationary phase. So we are trying to pitch enough yeast and control the growth so that there are still active hungry yeast when the sugars run out. Then they're going to look around and say, what else can we eat? I still have nutrient reserves. I can still reproduce. I just need some more food. Oh, there's some diacetyl. I'll eat that. There's some acetaldehyde. I'll eat that. Okay? That's what we're trying to do as brewers to promote maturation of our beers. So, pitching rates. Typically, like I said, 1 billion cells per liter per degree Plato. For ales, we can go lower than that, typically 0.75 billion per liter, down to 0.5 billion per liter, depending on yeast strain, depending on how much fermentation character we want to get into the beer. Lower pitching rates tend to produce more esters, more because there's more overall yeast growth. Lager brewing, we double our ale rates to 1.5 billion per liter. If you're brewing strong beers, high gravity beers greater than 1075, then we tend to bump those pitching rates up a little bit higher. Okay. It is hard to overpitch, okay, but it can happen. An overpitched beer, the main problem with an overpitched beer is a lack of fermentation character, okay? But a lack of esters or a lack of fusel alcohols, that little bit of complexity, that's usually not a big problem for most brewers, for most beers. The bigger problem where as homebrewers we occasionally run into is underpitching. And when you have an underpitched beer, then you have a lot of yeast stress, and you tend to have a lot of off flavors and a lack of a healthy active yeast at the end of fermentation to clean up those off flavors. So underpitching is the bigger problem. I see in the chat there's a question on how many days are needed for diacetyl rest. I think I talk about that in a minute. We'll should get to that. Okay, the third step in maturation. First step was to control the amount of yeast growth. Second step was to control the amount of growth with the pitching rate. And third step is to control the activity of that yeast. And this goes back to fermentation temperature. We're doing the diacetyl rest by raising the temperature of the beer in the last few days of fermentation. We're raising that by at least 3 degrees C, 5 degrees Fahrenheit towards the end of fermentation to keep the yeast active. Okay, yeast are more active at warmer temperatures. We will allow the fermentation to rest at that temperature, as a rule of thumb, for as many days as the high growth phase lasted. So typically 2 to 4 days would be more than adequate for diacetyl rest. Okay, again, the exact amount of time depends on how much acetohydroxy there is to clean up, how healthy that fermentation was, how the health of the yeast, a lot of factors. You as a brewer need to know your yeast, know your fermentation, and gauge that for yourself. Again, controlling activity. We want, after the sugars are gone, we want the yeast to be active so that they consume these VDKs and acetaldehyde. Sorry if I'm repeating myself. We manage diacetyl by managing the fermentation. Control yeast growth, pitching rate, fan levels, trub, oxygen. We control, those are the sufficient amount of nutrients. We control yeast growth by also managing the temperature. We want to start low and finish higher, doing that diacetyl rest. And by the way, this pertains to ale fermentations as well as lager fermentations, okay? This is yeast in general. Start them slow, start them cooler, not cold, but cooler, the lower end of their fermentation temperature range, and then contrive to raise the temperature of the fermentation, raise the temperature of the beer towards the end of fermentation to maintain activity. Okay, and you can raise the temperature by 5 degrees C as an example to help promote the chemical conversion of the precursors to diacetyl. Also, in controlling your maturation, be sure to give the yeast sufficient time to take up the diacetyl, a couple of days at least, especially if you're dry hopping, and I'll talk more about dry hopping in a minute, I think. Going back to acetaldehyde reduction a little bit, as I said, zinc is an important cofactor for the alcohol dehydrogenase that reduces it. The yeast require 50 parts per billion, or 0.05 ppm, to 0.3 ppm, 300 parts per billion of available zinc. Okay, very tiny amount. As you can see down below in the table, that 1 gram of zinc sulfate monohydrate in water would, if you're trying to hit that 0.05 number, you would require 511 gallons of water for that 1 gram of zinc sulfate. Okay, to hit the upper end, you'd require at least 85 gallons of water for that 1 gram of zinc sulfate to hit that 0.3 ppm. So they don't require very much. If you add too much zinc to your wort, the yeast are going to go crazy, and you tend to get more off flavors. Again, rapid yeast growth, more excess byproducts excreted into the wort. Okay, so commercial yeast is like, White Labs, Omega, Lallemand, Fermented, all the big yeast companies. They are growing their yeast with sufficient zinc, and the yeast have sufficient zinc out of the package to do 1 or 2 fermentations without any zinc additions. When you get beyond 3 fermentations on that same group batch of yeast with no zinc additions, then they're going to start needing it again. They're going to run out, and acetaldehyde reduction is going to suffer as a result. So that's where commercial brewers are adding zinc additions to their worts to supplement their yeast, because they are repitching their yeast 10, 20 generations before they get a fresh pitch. Okay, that's how zinc additions work. If you are doing sequential wort additions, and this is another topic for commercial brewers where you're doing 2 or 3 mashes and kettle boils to fill a single fermenter, it's important to fill those fermenters over within a 24-hour period. Don't exceed 24 hours, because each new wort that you add can bring in more acetohydroxy, and if they don't mix well, then you can have stratified fermentations where the 2 batches of wort exist at different densities and they don't mix. Even though it's all in the same tank, they just won't mix. And so you'll see stalled fermentations, you'll see high finishing gravities often as a result, and increased acetohydroxy acid and increased diacetyl in that beer as a result. So not really a homebrew topic, but more for the commercial brewer. There's some good resources out there in the journals about stratified fermentations and how to address them. Okay. All right. After maturation, so we've fermented the beer, we've done our diacetyl rest, even though it's an ale fermentation or a Kvike fermentation or a lager fermentation. We've done the diacetyl rest. The beer is clean. You think it's ready to package, but you're going to dry hop it first before you do that. Dry hopping can result in more diacetyl, and the reason for it is, well, there's several converging reasons. But when you dry hop, you tend to promote more small amount of additional fermentation, small amount of additional yeast growth. Fermentation is yeast growth from the yeast point of view. Again, they don't care about your beer, they care about reproducing. So lots of theories, and I think I haven't updated this slide. One theory that has been popular is that as a plant, hops contain alpha amylase, among other enzymes in their green matter. And it was the addition of these amylase enzymes from the hop plants that, combined with small amounts of oxygen introduced into the beer from the dumping into the hops and the circulation, that caused more yeast growth to occur. There's another theory out that just emerged last year from Dr. Charlie Bamforth and his colleagues, that these alpha enzymes are actually the amylase enzymes are actually coming from microorganisms that are riding on the hops. Bacteria and other microorganisms, yeast-like organisms, that see the dextrins in the beer and generate alpha amylase type or amylase type enzymes to break those down into digestible sugars, and that it then makes these fermentable sugars available to the yeast. The yeast take in the little bit of oxygen that comes in and this little bit of sugar and say, this is very amino acid poor worked right now with beer. I mean, it's already been fermented once. There's not much fan left over. I'm going to have to synthesize a lot of shit. And so they synthesize a lot of acetohydroxy acid, and that's how you end up with lots of acetohydroxy after dry hopping. Now, if you're a brewer and you're saying, okay, I fermented the beer tastes clean, it's done, it's great, let's dry hop. They dry hop for a couple days. Okay, let's chill and package it. And they do that, and they have just packaged beer full of acetohydroxy acid that, once that beer sits on the shelf, that acetohydroxy acid converts to diacetyl. Okay, and that's how we are ending up with diacetyl bombs in IPAs. One mechanism. Okay, so this is how dry hopping could cause more diacetyl. And again, this just kind of goes into that some more. We've also inhibited the yeast at this critical time. When you dry hop, you tend to raise pH, and in doing so, you upset the yeast's ability to maintain their cell integrity, that maintain the pH balance inside the cell to outside the cell. And so this imbalance, therefore, inhibits their ability to take up nutrients, such as acetohydroxy acids or maltose. And this information came from a good presentation that was on at the World Brewing Congress a couple of years ago. As these yeast cells age, as they lose vitality, they lose their ability to maintain this pH gradient, and this causes additional stress. The cell death can be increased, the yeast can autolyze, and pH can rise further. So one thing to watch for is a bump in pH beyond 0.2 pH due to excessive cell die-off. And of course, other indications of autolysis are meaty, brothy, bouillon type flavors, like smelling a jar of B vitamins and so on, as well as this can also lead to unfilterable haze caused by glycogen release. Okay, and here's an interesting chart from John Giordano that shows the viability of harvested lager yeast, where you have low hopping and usually no dry hopping, compared to an ale yeast harvest at the same brewery. But look at post-fermentation yeast viability, where the dry hopping has stressed the yeast more, and the yeast are less viable after fermentation for repitching. And then just differences in dry hopping contact time, and so on. So pretty substantial difference before dry hopping and after dry hopping. So to summarize diacetyl, it's produced by a chemical reaction. That chemical reaction is assisted by higher temperatures and lower pH. Therefore, we want to do a diacetyl rest to help that conversion along and then give the yeast sufficient time to clean it up. Maturation is a yeast function, and you as the brewer need to create the conditions for the yeast to maturate the beer. That's controlling the pitching rate, controlling the growth rate, controlling the total amount of growth, raising the temperature to maturate, giving the beer sufficient time to maturate, and then once maturation is done, then the beer can be chilled for clarification. Then you can cold crash and drop the haze, drop the yeast, clarify the beer. That takes anywhere from a week to 10 days, depending on the amount of calcium that's available to help flocculation and trobe formation, okay? And really what this means is no more long lagering. We now understand that traditional lagering methods, practices, were based on convenience. They didn't understand warm maturation. They didn't understand that this green beer cleanup was a function of the yeast, and that the yeast do it better warm. They do it much more slowly when they're cold. And so you can maturate the beer warmer if it's done in just a couple of days rather than a month. And then you can do the physical clarification of the beer by chilling it, and that takes at most 10 days typically. So, lagers, brew to door in, 3 weeks as opposed to 3 months. But it's due to the science of understanding what the yeast need. And I will now address questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, we'll start with the ask a question prompts. So
Okay.
if using an Erlenmeyer flask and magnetic stir to prep yeast really an advantage over not, how would you tell between both methods in an identical brew? Is it just yield benefits, or is there a taste profile difference too?
Yeah, that's a great question. The purpose of using a magnetic stir plate in a Erlenmeyer flask or any other flask is you're adding oxygen so that the yeast have sufficient oxygen, more than sufficient oxygen, to generate any of these nutrients that they don't see in the wort. And so the downside to stir plates is that if you leave the yeast on that stir plate too long, they're going to use up all of the nutrients in that starter wort. But they're still getting lots of oxygen. So they're going to start, burning their glycogen reserves with that oxygen. They're going to actually, they'll use up the sugars. They'll actually start respiring. They'll, start burning carbohydrate rather than eating carbohydrate for energy. And so you can end up, if you leave yeast on a stir plate too long, tiring the yeast out rather than invigorating them. So when you do make a yeast starter, you're putting it on that yeast starter, on that stir plate for really a maximum of 24, 36 hours. Watch the Croissant, and as soon as you see activity start to slow, turn the stir plate off. Let the wort cool. You don't have to throw in the fridge, but recognize that those yeast are ready to go. They're ready to pitch. The more longer you leave them alone, or leave them to the side and not pitch them, then they're going to start consuming those glycogen reserves. And you really, it's hard to judge this from just looking at a starter. You need to keep in mind the amount of time that it was on there.
All right. Next question from John. I keg my beers, but have had a few batches oxidize on me. Would you recommend adding something like ascorbic acid, metabisulfates, etc., to mitigate oxidation?
Yeah, you can. Ascorbic acid, vitamin C, is one way to take up oxygen in the beer. Metabisulfite, whether it's sodium or potassium metabisulfite, is another way. I think the best way, though, is making sure you purge your kegs with carbon dioxide. Hook up the gas and I often do it. I'll hook up the gas line to the dip tube so I can, flow gas to the bottom of the keg and push all the air out. You don't want a high flow rate. You want to gently do this to gently push it out, because if you use a rapid flow rate, with it blasting through there, you're going to end up mixing the gases. You're going to end up mixing the carbon dioxide with the room air and have retained oxygen that will still, oxidize your beer rather than slowly pushing the air out with the carbon dioxide. So keg purging is the best way to address it. You can add small amounts of ascorbic acid or metabisulfite. Keep in mind that a lot of people are sensitive to metabisulfite. It causes them to turn red and get itchy and so on. So I urge caution in using metabisulfite to scavenge oxygen. And if you use too much ascorbic acid, you're going to start to taste the vitamin C, that very citric, tart character in the beer as well.
All right. I seem to have missed this one. It's been voted to the top. I would like to dial in my spunding valve. Can you speak to appropriate pressure settings and timing of transfer, assuming my secondary fermenter is a 5-gallon keg?
I'm sorry, I can't. I've never done spunding like this. I believe, oh gosh, I don't know. Check out Drew Beecham and Denny Kahn's website for their podcast. Check out White Labs, and I think Blickman may have some materials on their websites regarding spunding, but I haven't done it. I believe you only want like one atmosphere at the most of overpressure. Maybe it's even a half atmosphere of overpressure on your spunding valve. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. And next question, what would you recommend for harvesting and washing yeast?
Any clean jar that allows you to, pour in, you swirl up the dregs of the fermenter, pour it in, add distilled water, swirl it around, recognize that in that first wash with distilled water that the dead yeast and the trub are going to settle to the bottom of the jar flask first, and that allows you to pour off the suspended yeast, the healthy yeast that's in the water, above that trub. So you'll discard the trub at the bottom of the flask, but if you wait too long, then your healthy yeast will settle to the bottom as well, and you'll end up discarding that. So, you swirl it up, look for dark stuff to settle to the bottom, and then pour off and discard the dark stuff. You want to end up with clean, creamy looking yeast in your flask. And usually this takes 2, sometimes 3 washings to get a decent harvest from doing this.
All right. Next one from Steve. I am most interested particularly in dry hopping IPAs fermented with free-range Kvike, which is typically around 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Given total fermentation could be 24 to 36 hours or less, do you cold crash or do you dry hop when it is still hot?
That's a good question. I certainly would cold crash. I hate that term, really. You can allow the fermentation to cool, but I would do it, I wouldn't throw it in the fridge. Take the heating blanket off and allow it to slowly cool down over several hours or over a day or so. Yes, you can dry hop warm. When you dry hop warm versus cold, you tend to extract more of the grassy notes from the hop. And so whenever you're dry hopping warm, you want to shorten your contact time. And so dry hopping warm like that, I would say 8 hours is probably the maximum contact time you would want. Some of the literature even says a shorter time, such as 5 hours, even at room temperature, is sufficient to get the vast majority of the dry hopping character into the beer. So the downside to short contact times is opening the fermenter and exposing the beer to oxygen. So you're going to have to contend with that as well. If you're dry hopping the fermenter or dry hopping the keg, see if you can't figure out a way to purge the headspace with carbon dioxide. Again, you want low flow carbon dioxide, gentle, entry of the gas to, purge the headspace rather than mixing the headspace.
All right. Next one from Lawrence. Can you cover restarting stalled fermentations? I've had several stall at 1.020.
Okay. Stalled fermentations, highly yeast strain dependent, and often I look to the sugars, in the wort composition as like the main factor for repeated stalled fermentations. It could be that you have an uncalibrated thermometer that's leading to high mash temperatures, therefore leading to high dextrin percentage, and that's high final gravities as a result of that. It could be the yeast. It could be the fermentation conditions that are resulting in that stalled fermentation. Temperature control, again, it helps to raise the temperature of the fermentation in the last day or two to help keep those yeast active and keep the yeast from flocculating and dropping out and having a stalled fermentation. So, but yeah, look to your wort and the sugar composition as a first touch. Also, you can do a forced fermentation. That is, take a sample of that wort and put it in a flask, just like 2 cups worth. Pitch a whole packet of yeast into that, give it air on the stir plate and so on. That will ferment completely. I mean, that will ferment as much as it can possibly ferment, especially if it's warm. And you will know what the final gravity is for that particular wort. It may be 1020. And again, that would point to the worts, the malts and ingredients that you're making that wort with, rather than a yeast cause or a temperature cause, something like that.
All right. And I think you kind of touched on this one, but you might have more to add. This is from Greg. John, can you touch base on your thoughts on new dry hopping practices of dry hopping cooler and for shorter periods of time?
Okay. Yeah. Man, dry hopping, it's like fishing. Every day you turn around, there's another technique or theory. But yeah, in general, the trends seem to go that shorter contact times tend to reduce the amount of grassiness that you get from dry hopping. Also tend to reduce the amount of hop burn that you can get from dry hopping. Hop burn, again, seeming to be this tannic chlorophyll character that just very, very unpleasant in the mouth. So shorter contact times help there. Cooler temperatures help again in reducing the amount of tannins, polyphenols that come from the hop cones. Scott Janish and others that are more in tune with dry hopping probably have much more to say on this subject than I do. My interests tend to lean toward the mash side of things. But yeah, check out Scott Janish's blog. I think he has a lot more to say on this and give you some better understanding than I can at the moment.
Okay. Gary would like to know, how long will a recovered yeast from a fermentation last if kept in a refrigerator? Is it weeks or months or years?
Definitely weeks at the most. Yeah, they go in, to this stationary phase. You wash them. You're not providing oxygen. You're not providing nutrients. That helps them stay in that hibernated phase. They're going to live off their glycogen reserves. Okay, so when they're in the fridge, you want them low activity. Any oxygen you expose to them, they're going to use up glycogen to, metabolize. But eventually they will turn from white to creamy to ivory to tan to brown. And when they're peanut butter colored, they're mostly dead. And there's no point in pitching that yeast to another beer. You could pitch it to a starter and then harvest clean yeast, white yeast from that starter, and then do another starter and build them up and pitch that to a new batch. But yeah, don't pitch brown yeast to your beer. Yeah, they're mostly dead, and it won't be a good fermentation.
All right. This is from John. I want to try to brew a brute IPA for the first time. I've read conflicting information on when to use the amyloglucosidase enzyme. Would you recommend using it in the mash or the fermenter?
Generally, I recommend using it in the mash. That way, the enzyme will be deactivated during the boil, and you won't have residual fermentation. You won't have further dextrin breakdown in the package, because that's the risk. That's why we get exploding cans and bottle bombs, is that if there's residual dextrin breakdown, the yeast will continue to slowly ferment these simple sugars that result, and that's where you get overpressurization and diacetyl as a result in the package. So yeah, if you have a kegging system, you could do it in the fermenter. and then chill that keg and manage the pressure on that keg. But if you're bottling or canning, no, I definitely do it the mash, so you can boil and deactivate the enzyme.
All right. Neil would like to know, since post-fermentation oxygen is beer's worst enemy, is the foam left behind from no-rinse sanitizer detrimental to kegging beer? The bubbles are just air, which contains oxygen.
No, that the foam left from sanitizing is, you're racking the beer into the fermenter, you're taking that fermented beer and putting it into a keg. You're going, as the beer fills, you're going to get some oxygen from the bubbles onto the beer. But if you purge the headspace, you'll get rid of most of that. I guess when it comes to sanitizing kegs and bottles, allowing them to drain upside down, getting that most of that foam out is probably the best practice.
All right. Steve, for a home brewer who has been repitching slurry for years, sometimes over 10 times generations, it sounds like I should be adding zinc to reduce diacetyl, which I have noticed small amounts in the past. FYI, I always make a starter unless the slurry is 1 to 2 days old and add a bit of urea to the starter. What product is preferred to add zinc? It's not clear. That's in the White Labs nutrient. They don't list everything in that.
Yeah. Cervomyces, yeast nutrient, contains zinc. Look at the various products to see which ones contain zinc. Adding zinc sulfate, for example, which you can easily buy on Amazon. You buy a jar of it or a pound of it, that'll last you, 100 years, because so little of it is needed. And the zinc is not reducing the diacetyl, it's reducing the acetaldehyde. Okay, acetaldehyde being the green apple, fresh paint, sliced pumpkin type aroma. I would say if you are repitching your yeast over 10 generations, then I would look at adding a yeast nutrient that contains zinc, such as White Labs Cervomyces.
All right. This is from John. I'm a recent Anvil Foundry 10.5 owner. I've used it several times, but have struggled with mash efficiency, percent in the low 60s. I tried using the small batch adapter ring, added rice hulls, and mash at 149. My mash pH is 5.2 to 5.3, and grain bill is 16 pounds, Anvil's recommended max. Do you have any other tips or suggestions? Thanks in advance.
Okay. And I see that people have talked about grain crush as a huge component of efficiency. No, not really. The biggest component to efficiency is your water to grist ratio, and how much water, how much wort is left behind in the grain. When you're using the Anvil Foundry, and I have an Anvil Foundry and I brew on it. If you're doing a no sparge method, okay, you're going to get lower efficiency because you are retaining wort of a high gravity, whatever gravity that may be. It could be 1050, it could be 1075. If you're maxing out the grain bill like 16 pounds, that's a lot of retained wort. And so, you're going to get less wort into the kettle and thereby lose efficiency that way. No sparge, there's charts in the current edition of How to Brew in the yellow book here. Charts in there that show you straight out what the efficiency of no sparge is with regard to increasing original gravity. And it starts at like 80 at 1035 and goes down to 60 at 1080 or 1090, something like that. And it's because of the amount of retained wort that's in the grain. Brew in a bag, where you have the weight of the grain in the bag acting to compress the bag and squeeze out more wort, has better efficiency because you're actually squeezing more wort out of the grain, less retained wort, better efficiency, typically about 5% better. And I know Blickman in the Anvil manual recommends like a small sparge of like 1 gallon to help rinse out some of that retained wort. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, just because your efficiency is in the low 60s doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything wrong. It could be just the numbers, the gravities that you're working with, and so on. It's just a natural result of that. Crush can be a factor, but even uncrushed grain can produce 60% efficiency. Okay, so I don't necessarily think it's the degree of crush. There are some other factors as well, but I think those are the two big ones.
All right. Patrick says, I have perpetual DO issues with dry hopped beers. I've switched from carboys to kegs for dry hopping, filled keg with sandy water and pushed it out with CO2, added dry hop charge, purged again with CO2 for 3 minutes. Still oxidized heavily by first pour. Need help making my dry hopped beers be as bright and aromatic as a brewery's.
Huh. Well, it sounds, I mean, especially with the purging of water, pushing that with CO2 and so on, you should be able to minimize the oxygen in the keg. But of course, if you're adding dry hops to the keg, that is some oxygen ingress there. Adding your hops to water and making a slurry and pouring the slurry in is one way to lower oxygen, pickup when dry hopping, versus just dumping in some pellets or putting them in a grain bag and putting them in. Yeah, again, watch the amount, watch how you're adding the carbon dioxide to the keg. Watch how you're purging that, because again, like I said, if you do it too fast, you're going to end up mixing the gases rather than pushing the gas. But yeah, can't think of anything to really add to that.
All right, we have time for a couple more here. We appreciate your time, John. When doing a high gravity beer, do you recommend adding more yeast nutrients? I'm looking to do a 14 to 15% beer.
Yeah, that wouldn't hurt. Adding a good yeast nutrient is probably a word to the wise. Pitching rate, of course, is critical. Use, that 0.75 or 1 billion cells per liter per degree Plato guideline. Make sure you have a sufficient number of yeast, and use a yeast that likes high gravity. The Kvike yeasts enjoy high gravity beers. They do better with them, but most 14 to 50% is pretty high. Like your California ale yeast generally get up to 12, even 13, but you've got to really manage the fermentation. And so I'd say, definitely more nutrient, but pitching rate is probably your best bet for achieving that high in alcohol.
All right. Trent says, I'm struggling with an off flavor that is consistent across all my beers. Best way to describe it is a dry, sharp, grainy, alcoholic flavor. Yes, I know beer is grain and alcohol. Could this be a result of under pitching?
could be. Sharp, grainy, dry. Yeah, it could. It could also be diastaticus. I've had that flavor from beers that have diastaticus contamination, wild yeast contamination, in other words. Wild yeast contamination is very common in homebrew equipment. I mean, if you've got a bottling bucket or hoses that you always use, the diastaticus, it's in the air. It can get into each and every fermentation. It ferments all the dextrins out, leaves you with a beer with very low mouthfeel, a little higher alcohol, and a very fizzy, sharp flavor. Yeah, so that could be the problem. And replace your plastic stuff, if that's the case, or get some aggressive cleaning and sanitizing regimen going with your other equipment, for your stainless and stuff. Take valves apart and make sure that you clean and sanitize all the pieces to the valves to help get the diastaticus out.
All right. And then last one here is from Gary. You speak about the importance of adding zinc as a nutrient. Where would I purchase a brewing zinc sulfate product, please?
Yeah. For home brewers, I would ask for it at your local homebrew shop or one of the online shops. The White Lab Cervomyces, which incorporates yeast hulls, that contains zinc, and that's a very good source for it. It's not too much zinc. If you're a commercial brewer, then actual zinc sulfate monohydrate is a good source for it. You can get that off Amazon or other chemical companies, but a little goes a really long way. So that's really more suited for commercial operation.
All right. So I think we're pretty much at time, if not a little bit over for today. So thank you everyone who joined us. Thanks again, John. I did just want to share a quick reminder of our next presentation is February 22nd with Greg Matthews from Platt Park. We have a presentation in March on distilling, and then we will have John Palmer back with us in April talking about water. So once again, thank you so much, John. I will send out an email with this presentation and with John's contact information that he provided at the end of the presentation, just in case you have any other follow-up questions or anything in regards to that. Just another reminder, we're also, we will do a drawing if you attended today's presentation for copies of John's books. So we will send that out with a follow-up. Once again, thank you, John, for joining us. And thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye.